I'm really thrilled and I have to be honest, very, very excited to be able to welcome Don Bachardy on a rare visit to the UK from California, and Katherine Bucknell to Small Wonder. Katherine will tell you more about Don, so I'm just going to give you a very brief overview. Don Bachardy met the celebrated English author Christopher Isherwood on a Santa Monica beach when he was still a teenager, he being Don. Their lives remained intertwined for the next half-century until Christopher Isherwood's death in 2006, and Don still lives in the house they shared. Christopher Isherwood was the successful author of Goodbye to Berlin, on which Cabaret was based, and Mr. Norris Changes Trains, which was, together with several other of Isherwood's books, published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf at the Hogarth Press. Isherwood then had emigrated to the US just before World War II with his friend and literary collaborator W.H. Auden. The associations with Bloomsbury make it a particular pleasure to introduce Don Bachardy, who himself became a successful portrait painter, to Charleston, to talk about his relationship with Christopher Isherwood, traced via the romantic letters they wrote to each other. Katherine Bucknell, who edited the love letters between Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy, is the perfect chairperson for this occasion. She's also the editor of Isherwood's Diaries and a founder of the W.H. Auden Society, so she's got a whole perspective on the era and on the relationship. So I'm delighted to hand over to Katherine Bucknell and to welcome them both to Small Wonder.
Well, that's very nice. This is such a lovely place. We've just enjoyed the garden and the wonderful tea. Don has drawn and painted over 10,000 portraits. Many of them are of celebrated artists, writers, movie stars, socialites. Some of his finest are of relatively anonymous sitters. He works most days in his studio in Santa Monica, and he still lives in the house where he lived with Christopher Isherwood. They were companions for 33 years. Diane has mentioned some of Christopher Isherwood's 7 novels, and he also wrote a series of autobiographies, and over the last decade or so, the diaries have been published, which run to over 1 million words in 4 volumes. The diaries offer an intermittent narrative of Isherwood's relationship with Don, which began officially on Valentine's Day in 1953 when Don was 18 and Chris was 48. They ignored the disapproval of friends and strangers alike when they moved in together, 2 men 30 years apart in age, openly defying social convention and privately breaking the law. Their life together was rich and challenging. It was not always easy. In 1963, they briefly celebrated. Making a long-term relationship between 2 men was a project for which there was no blueprint, and they had to find their own path day after day. So we now have a volume of letters written when they were sometimes apart during the years 1956 to 1970, and these allow us inside their relationship in an entirely new way into the conversation they conducted privately with one another. The voice of the young Don Bachardy, whom many looked on only as a gorgeous boy at Isherwood's side, is startlingly robust. He's a terrific natural writer, and we have a previously unknown range of tone from Isherwood. The very first pair of letters was written in 1956 when Chris took Don on a grand tour of Europe for Don's 21st birthday, and they returned by way of England, where they spent several months. Chris went to Cheshire to visit his family, leaving Don in London because he thought the conditions at home were too primitive to risk exposing his beloved young partner to. That's the first absence. There are lots of other absences which arise after, but I think, Don, you were going to read us that very first pair of letters?
Yes, it was really the first time we were separated, and therefore the first letters we ever wrote to each other. And I was indeed 21, and I'd been with Chris since I was 18. And though 18 is the legal age, officially I was an adult. I looked so young at the time that Chris prudently waited until I was 21 to be absolutely certain there wouldn't be trouble. He'd had trouble at the bringing his German boyfriend, Heinz Niedermeyer, into the England. The passport customs people were very suspicious and asked lots of probing questions. So Chris wanted to avoid another such encounter. So he waited till I was 21. But anyway, it's still, I still look very young then. And here's his first letter to me, dated the 1st of February, 1956. Dearest Donnie, I wonder so much what you are doing, and I hope so much that you're having fun and interesting adventures. He left me alone in London while he went to visit his mother and brother because, as Kate has just said, because he was worried that Wibbersley Hall, where he'd been born and where his mother and brother were living, was very damp and uncomfortable and primitive in its appointments, and he was afraid it might discourage a boy from Southern California. And also, I think he wanted to prepare his mother and brother because, as I said, I still look very young. But Wednesday, he says, looking forward to the end of the week when he would be back in London. And when you get this, it will be Thursday, and then there will only be Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But I mustn't get rattled. I keep looking anxiously at the snow, which fell last night, and wondering if more will fall and block the roads. But I'll get through somehow, like in that courbet at the National Gallery. This house is as damp as a sponge and cold. You can see your breath even when standing by the fire. And the sheets are damp like grave clothes, and the books on the shelves smell of corpses. And in the kitchen and scullery, there are very old smells of dried fat in skillets and old black rags that are quite frighteningly filthy in a 19th century way, like something out of our Oliver Twist. I don't say all this just in complaint. A lot of it is hilariously funny or very touching, and I'm glad I came alone because it's really easier to take. I spend a lot of time scrubbing things. If only the pipes don't freeze. My mother is absolutely marvelous, sharp as a needle, sees well, hears perfectly, remembers everything, talks all day long. Poor Richard is turning rapidly into a prematurely aged freak. His face around the nose is dark purple, bad circulation, I guess, and he has lost several of his teeth in front, and he walks with a stoop and keeps his head down. But he is so kind and gentle and anxious to help. He fills my bed with hot water bottles, leaving marks on the sheets because his poor hands are chronically covered with coal dust. He is forever building fires or making tea, which is pure liquid brass. They have 2 white cats. The female has a black smudge over one eye, and she is fat with kittens, fathered by the other cat, her son. She is one of the best-looking cats I have ever seen, and she doesn't give a shit about any of us. If I didn't hate the cold so, I'd admit that this place is marvelously beautiful. Cobden Edge, the first ridge of moorland behind the house, is all white, and there is a strange orange light on the snow. The bare trees are so black against it. Cheerful, stamping men in mufflers bring milk and newspapers, from which I see that Emlyn Williams and Charlie Chaplin were both at Corder's funeral, Alexander Corder's funeral. Maybe Molly will fix for you to meet him, and or Lady Olivier, who was there too. He knew that I was a great devotee of Vivian Lee. Unless I send a telegram to the contrary, I will arrive at Euston Station Monday afternoon at 1:55. No need to meet me if you have something else to do. I just tell you so you'll know approximately when I'll be at the hotel, about 2:30. Leave word for me there if you're not coming to the station, but I hope you do. Imagine thinking I wouldn't come to the station. I hadn't seen him for a week, and it was our first separation, and I remember I was so glad to see him, I burst into tears, and he was very embarrassed. Imagine, this is the first letter I wrote you. I think about you all the time, and about times I might have been kinder and more understanding, and I make many resolutions for the future, some of which I hope I'll keep. In any case, all my love, Chris. And this was my letter to him. Dear Chris, it is freezing here. It snowed most of yesterday and even began to lay on the iron steps outside the window. I was staying at the Cavendish Hotel on Jermyn Street. But today, the snow is all gone, and though clear and sunny, it is much colder. I am still in bed. It's past 12, because it's the only warm place. I have been reading and working on my play. I am amazed. I worked 3.5 hours yesterday morning and 3 hours this morning, and now I have 8 pages of solid notes and, I think, a very good outline for the first 2 acts. I've managed to think up a surprisingly well-constructed plot, although there is not much of a story, and already I know roughly what the 3rd act will consist of. I feel quite silly, especially in the afternoon and early morning, when I think of writing this play, but nevertheless it is going well and it is fun. It's a very heavy drama. I hope this isn't a mistake. And not very original, but with a few surprises. As of yet, you have not appeared. It may very well be a thing of the past by next Monday. I really haven't written more than just a few snatches of dialogue yet. John, I don't even know his last name yet. Cuthbert's friend. Cuthbert Worsley was a critic and a writer too, and John Luscombe was his last name, was his young friend. John called yesterday morning and took me to Fresh Airs last night. It was a review in the London Theatre. I thought it was very dull and trivial and very poorly organized and produced. Too much dull and trivial and very poorly organized, too much really amazing, trashy sentiment. I thought a review was essentially based on gags and laughs, but right in the middle of supposedly funny skits were very serious, straight-faced, sentimental numbers with nothing but the corniest lyrics. There were endless sets and costumes, all ugly, and the most amateurish dancing and pantomiming I've ever seen out of high school. Here and there were a few amusing gags, all very proper, except for a terribly shocking skit about a Paris pissoir and some asides from Max Adrian, who got in drag too. But the funniest thing was a political skit making fun of America, doing her all to make Germany happy. John and I got along very well. He's really very nice and has a lot of the same difficulties that I've got, so there's quite a bit for us to talk about. I think the difficulties were there was a big age difference between him and Cuthbert too, and I think he was also wondering about a profession. I don't know if I can't remember if he was considering being a playwright too. But anyway, John and I got along very well. He's really very nice and has a lot of the same difficulties that I've got. So there's quite a bit for us to talk about. I took him to dinner at the Comedy, and we had drinks at the hotel before dinner. He even invited me to spend a few days with him and Cuthbert, but I firmly refused for various reasons. I think he is interested in me, but I most definitely don't reciprocate any kind of similar interest. No one else has called, and I haven't made any calls myself. Yesterday, I saw The Constant Husband with Rex Harrison and Margaret Leighton. It was very boring. And A Life at Stake with Angela Lansbury and Keith Andes. A quickie thriller made on location in LA with a weak, silly story, but still interesting. She was good. You don't have to bother with either film, though. The day before, I saw White Cargo, which was mild fun, and Moulin Rouge, which was still beautiful, but unbelievably trashy and pompous and self-consciously chic, and in places really foul. This was a John Huston film, a beautiful Technicolor film. Gosh, how harsh I was. Huston gives himself away in this. I wonder how he gave himself away. Anyway, I saw The Boyfriend in the evening. It's not nearly as good as in New York and seemed very jokes over. Jokes over was a phrase that came from Dodie Smith. It was her condemnations of plays that went on too long. They had one joke, and once the joke was over, so was the play. Only the playwright didn't know it. Let's see. but I had a seat in the front row and flirted unmercifully with the chorus boys all through it. But I miss rides through London on old Dublin, especially in the snow yesterday. Our animal terms for each other were already established. He is an old horse, and I is a long-furred white kitten. And I think a lot about him, Dublin, sleeping in a strange stable, eating cold oats out of an ill-fitting feed bag, and having no cat fur to keep him warm. And don't let them put any frozen bits in his mouth, and tell him an anxious tabby is at the mercy of the RSPCA and counting the days till his return. Love, Don, and I've written in ink a paw print next to my name. P.S. Don't forget about the movies. What do I mean by that?
I think you wanted
Oh, Bachardy was, Kate's note, Bachardy was reminding Isherwood to film his mother and brother and Wibbersley, the house where they all were. So, those were our first letters together. Already our characters were established.
Wonderfully read, and so much evidence of this obsession you and Chris shared for the theater and the movies. You already writing a play. How many movies did you see while he was gone? I mean, did you see one every day?
Oh, I went to the movies during the day and to a theater every night. And that fresh air, as I probably wouldn't have, I would have ruled it out, except that I had so many evenings on my own. So, but the severity of the criticism, I'm afraid is still typical of me.
I know Don wants anyone who would like to ask any questions that you would like to, and it's a little difficult to. Can you see anyone's faces? Or
not really. It's harder to.
Oh, that's terrific.
Oh, good. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I might ask you just to talk a little bit about your interest in the movies and also in the theater, because I was wondering, when is the first time you started going to plays? Was that in Los Angeles?
I'm trying. Yes, I did see some plays. The first one I can remember is a production of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. That must have been. I think it opened in New York in 1950, around then, and this was the road company in Los Angeles. So I can't think of any other theater I'd seen, but my mother was a devoted moviegoer in the 20s. Teens and 20s, and then she married my father against her father's wishes. She was a very introverted girl when she was growing up, but and kept under control by her father. But once she was in her 20s, she became independent, and it was her father was totally against marrying my father. Her father was a captain of a Great Lakes boat, and my father was working in the hold, and she and her sister were taking a summer holiday on the boat, and so they were in the captain's quarters on the bridge, and looking down from above, probably standing under their summer umbrellas. And my mother espied my husband, my father, stripped to the waist and looking very hot, I think she thought. So she flirted with him and had a romance with him, totally against her father's wishes, and even married him. I know her father was at the wedding because I have a photograph of her and my father with her father next to them. But after the wedding, their honeymoon was to drive from Cleveland to Los Angeles, and my mother, being a fervent moviegoer, I'm sure, designated Los Angeles because that's where Hollywood was. She and my father settled down, and soon my brother Ted was born, and 4 years later I was born in 1934. And Ted and I both grew up already habitués of the movies at early ages, because while my father was working in an aircraft company, my mother took Ted and me downtown to movie theaters, where we sometimes, I remember, this was during World War II, where we sometimes saw 3 movies in a row, which we could never do if my father hadn't been away working. He wasn't a moviegoer and disapproved of my mother wasting his money on moviegoing. So Ted and I were sworn to secrecy, and we were pretty faithful. Yes, movies were a very early enthusiasm, and Ted and I devoted, every bit as devoted movie fans as my mother had been. And when I was probably 16 and Ted would have been 20, we started going to Hollywood movie premieres. We didn't have tickets, but we put on our best jackets and ties and slipped in by picking out a couple who had tickets and standing very close behind them. And there was a ticket taker on either side, so they never knew whether or not the other one had taken our tickets, and that's how we got in. And once in, we had our autograph books at the ready and just made a killing, getting autographs and lots of major stars. And eventually, we took a camera with us, a really primitive little brownie camera, but it did have a flashlight attachment, and we took pictures of each other standing up next to the movie stars as they signed our books. And I still have all those pictures, and a friend even made 8 by 10 enlargements for me of them all. And people like Montgomery Clift and Joan Crawford and Deborah Carr and Betty Davis and Robert Mitchum, many of our favorite, Betty Davis, and special favorite, and that was very exciting for us, and that was my life. at the time, I got to know Chris. And as soon as we started living together, Chris didn't want me sneaking in anywhere. And I knew that he was right and took his advice and did it only one more time, which was an Academy Awards ceremony, which there was a particularly big lot of movie actors, and that was the last time. So,
Don, there's a really when you said there's a link really between your going to the movies and observing these images up on a screen and the beginning of your work as an artist, even though as a child it's the sketching that you were doing, I think, from movie magazines, and maybe you could tell a little bit about that as well.
Yes, I think I know I got my interest in faces from looking at those giant close-ups of movie actors, and Ted was a very good, he had a real knack for drawing, and he was my big brother, and I followed suit. I copied him, and my drawings were very primitive compared to his, and he used to quite correctly correct my drawings, and eventually I was doing very identifiable likenesses, and they were all copies of pictures of portraits of movie stars in movie magazines, and I showed a selection of them to Chris, and he was able to identify all the actors and asked me, had I ever drawn from life? And I hadn't, and he said, well, why don't you try? And proposed himself as a sitter. And that was the first drawing I ever did from life. And I did what I did with all the copies of movie star pictures. I put in everything I could see. But the movie star pictures were all retouched. And here was my first live sitter, and I put in everything I could see, including pouches and crow's feet at the eyes, and it was just natural for me to put in everything I could see. And that first picture of Chris, which I still have, when he came around to look at what I'd done, there was an awful silence before he almost gulped and said, "It's good." And it did look very like him, but like an old man version of him. And when many years later I was doing drawings of him in his 70s and early 80s, that first drawing was still the oldest looking drawing I'd ever done. And but it did look like him, and so I eventually responded to his continual urgings of me to start art school, and I did finally sign up for a summer course. I was afraid of failing. Scared, really, that I wouldn't make the grade, but in fact, I found I could draw as well or better than all the other beginning students. So I was so encouraged. By the end of the first week, I'd already signed up for the fall term, and went the next 4 years, every day from 9 to 4, and usually 7 to 10 for the night class. And I was really so relieved to feel that I found my vocation. And of course, I had endless encouragement from Chris, who was there every day when I came home, saying, "Show me what you did." And then we'd go through all the drawings, and he would pick out his favorites, and oh, that's a good one. And that was exactly what I needed, and it went on for the next 4 years, and then I gradually began to draw people from life that Chris and I were meeting, friends of his. We were already, he was taking me to the Aldous Huxleys and to the Stravinskys, and I was still a very young-looking boy, and it only occurred to me later how amazing of him to dare to take this very young-looking boy to these distinguished people, and they were very kind to me. It couldn't have been sweeter. The Stravinskys became such good friends. It was our favorite house to go to. Igor and Vera and Bob Kraft, their young friend, composer friend who lived with them, and Igor became my first celebrity sitter. And one of the nights we went to the house for dinner, I was encouraged to bring my drawing board and drawing equipment, and he sat for 4 drawings. He was stretched out on a sofa, and the first drawing of him turned out so well that I used it on the announcement of my first New York show in 1962, and the drawing of Igor was probably in 1960, and I did 3 more, and there was another one that I thought was very good too. So, and I was trembling at the idea of drawing this, as sweet as he was to both of us. I was still awed by him, but he was so agreeable, and he never gave up reading. But that somehow made it easier for me. I later began to ask everyone I drew to look at me, because that eye contact, though it could be very intimidating, also gave me a kind of, I guess it was the excitement of daring to look into somebody's eyes to draw them, that I really began to be excited about the work I was doing, and that was wonderfully encouraging for me.
I'm just thinking about Bloomsbury people who would have perhaps come here. I'm thinking, did you got to draw Morgan Forster?
Yes,
much later on. Yes.
In 1961, and I remember I went to him, and of course I wanted to do the very best I could, and I'd been encouraged by the first drawings of Huxley and Stravinsky, and Morgan sat in a kind of low-slung chair with his arms out. He had very characteristic long-fingered hands, and I was good at hands too. And I did a first drawing of him, which made him laugh when he looked at it. He said, I think he laughed because he looked so serious, and I did get the slump that he was sitting in. I couldn't make anything up, I wouldn't have dared to ask him to sit up straight. And then he made it clear to me that the sitting was over, and for me, the first drawing was just warm-up, but I didn't dare ask for more. But I showed Chris the first drawing, and he saw that it was characteristic of my first drawings, that usually the second and third were better. And Joe Ackley, who was a very good friend of Morgan, said, Chris and I told him that I'd hoped to do more drawings. So I was surprised he went to Morgan and said, you ought to let Don do more drawings. So I got another sitting, and he sat for 3. And I did, and the very first drawing of that second sitting, I imagined everything was riding on it, and it turned out the best of the 3 I did, and was used as a frontispiece in Morris, the British edition of Morris. No, it was in the New York edition. It was the frontispiece, and it was used on the book jacket, on the cover of the book jacket of Morris in the British edition. And that was very exciting for me, and my first drawing on a book jacket. So that was a real notch in my belt.
Wow. Do please put up a hand if you have anything you want to ask Don. Yeah.
Can we get the mic down here?
Thank you. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear Don?
Yes.
From my reading, before he met you, Chris had been much influenced by the Hindu philosophy of Vedanta. Did you come to share in that, or how did that impact on your relationship?
Yes, in those first months, as well as taking me to the Huxleys and the Stravinskys, he also took me to Prabhavananda, and it was an indication of how important Prabhavananda was to Chris, that he regarded Huxley and Stravinsky as tryouts, and if they succeeded, then and I think he actually was a little bit embarrassed to take me to Swami, because Swami was hoping to make a monk out of Chris, and here was Chris introducing his teenage boyfriend to him. But Prabhavananda was so determined. He was very proud to have Chris as a devotee, so maybe a slight gulp could have been heard, but he also swallowed me. And even eventually sat for me. And yes, one of those drawings of Swami was published. I can't remember where
On
now.
the cover of My Guru and His Disciple.
Oh, yes,
yeah?
yes. Eventually, one of them got onto the cover of My Guru and His Disciple, which was, yes, Chris's book about his friendship with
And
Bob
it's an
Arthur.
interesting thing that when you and Chris had a separation in 1963, that one of your gestures towards the relationship and towards Chris and coming back together again was saying that you wanted to be initiated by Swami, yeah?
Yes. Chris never proselytized. He never prodded me. He just explained to me very early on what Vedanta was and what it meant to him, and no further pushing of me in any way. And so it was 10 years before I announced to him that I would like to be initiated too. And I was, and I realized that that's what Chris had been hoping for, because he was very pleased that we could be Vedantists together. And so I always accompanied him on Wednesday nights to the Vedanta Center because, and we had dinner with Swami and the other monks and nuns who lived at the center. And after dinner, Chris did a reading from the book about Ramakrishna, and then answered questions from the congregation, and yes, and he Chris died with his beads still, his rosary beads, and I know it was a great help to him, and it's been the same for me, and I still tell my beads every night before I go to bed.
You once said something to me that I think is very telling. You said, Chris is my guru.
Yes, he was, of course. Swami was very impressive, and but it was really Chris who was my guru, and Chris himself said, Vedanta is all very well, and it was to him the very best explanation of any kind of mysticism, but that his real key to it went beyond Vedanta to Swami himself as an embodiment of what he believed. And he saw in Swami something really very important and moving to him personally. And I felt the same about Chris as he did about Swami. I didn't tell him that, and he, I think he would have been embarrassed if I had, and it wasn't necessary to tell him.
In the back there's, yeah.
Hi. As a lifelong movie buff, what was your reaction to Tom Ford's directorial debut, A Single Man?
To what?
A Single Man, the film that came out with...
What I think of it, or the reviews of it?
Well, what your reaction was when you knew he was going to be directing the film and the film itself.
You know, I like Tom Ford, and Kate and I had dinner with him last night, and his very nice friend Richard Buckley, and he was full of energy and talking and gesturing and telling us really how unsatisfactory his fashion is, the fashion world, and how tired of it he is, and saying it really wasn't good enough. But I question that, because how can you be as good as he is at what he does about something that you don't really love? So I think he was misleading both of us. But anyway, how did I get onto?
You were going to say what?
About the film. Yes, I think for a first-time director, it was just amazing, and that he really wrote the script himself, and that's very tough material to make a movie out of. And I thought his casting of the film was. Each character I thought was so well cast, and Colin Firth just a kind of miracle as George. I mean, it just exactly right, and it's so difficult to get the whole point of it across, but. I think even Chris himself would have liked the movie. I wish I would love to be able to see it with Chris and get his reaction. But I thought it was, and I saw it several times, and it never seemed less than what I thought the first time I saw it. I really was very surprised and pleased. And I'm sorry to say, he seems to be caught up in fashion again, Tom Ford, and he was. I asked him a couple of years ago, was he still planning a second film? And he said, "Oh, yes, indeed, yes, indeed." I asked him again last night, and it wasn't so positive. And I don't see why, if he is dissatisfied with fashion, he won't do it, because the first film was certainly enough of a success. He could get backing again and make another, but I hope he will.
Yeah.
Wonderful listening to you. Would you be prepared to share any thoughts on how your relationship over this long time evolved and how you influenced each other's work?
Can I just wait? Did you hear that at the back? No. Can you repeat it, Kate? Did you just repeat the question?
Yes, the gentleman has asked, correct me if I get it wrong, would Don share his thoughts on how his relationship with Chris evolved over the years and what their influence was on one another?
My relationship with Chris evolved because he was, and still is, the most extraordinary person I ever met. On so many levels. I can only say, if you could have known him, just spent an hour or two with him, I wouldn't have to answer that question. He was so reassuring, and he meant everything he said, and he could back it up, and his example was extraordinary, and he's still a great support to me, essential.
That's a really nice answer, Don.
I don't even have to consciously think about him anymore, because I think I I carry him with me. But he wouldn't approve at all of my sitting here crying.
Don, do you want to have a little break?
I'm okay.
You're okay? We could have another question. I don't know if you want to talk about collaborating with Chris on the film scripts and movies and theater scripts that you wrote together, Frankenstein or A Meeting by the River. I think one of the things that it comes across if you have the opportunity to get to read the animals is some of the separations that Don and Chris had. Don came to study at the Slade in London and work on his portraiture here, and he had his first show at the Redfern, and followed the following year by a show in New York, and a pretty busy career from then on. So there were lots of shows, and there were also those would take Don away from home. And Don also worked a lot in the theater, drawing theater posters for Tony Richardson was the first set of theater posters you did, and he did them for Tennessee Williams and for Julie Harris, various productions in the States in the early 60s. And later on, Chris and Don worked together, and Chris on his own for Tony Richardson, writing film scripts. And then they did an adaptation of Chris's novel, A Meeting by the River, Chris's last novel. They adapted both for the stage and for the screen. And it was staged very successfully in Los Angeles, and it was staged briefly on Broadway in a theater that I think was much too big for it. And there are a lot of letters covering all this very busy professional life throughout the 60s and later on, which I'm sure all of you would really enjoy reading them. I know there were some more questions down in the front. Yes.
I was just wondering, I'm another movie fan myself, and I was just wondering, very basic question, but what is your favourite film and why?
Oh, I have so many favorite films and many favorite actors, and I'm so lucky to have actually had sittings with many of my favorite movie people. Gosh, I can't even think. There are just so many films I love. And yet, as my letter betrayed, I'm as critical as ever, and the movie actors I hate. But films, gosh.
You mentioned the other day Bette Davis made a big impression on you, and you mentioned Jezebel when you were really
My
very young.
three favorite films of hers, well, there are four. The three she made with William Wyler, Jezebel, The Letter, and The Little Foxes, and Margot Channing, All About Eve. Those are, if you only see those four films, you get the very best of her, according to me. And even Chris allowed her performance in The Letter. He, of course, had seen Tallulah Bankhead and said she was just stunning. And Davis, you see, wasn't British, couldn't possibly be British, and he didn't believe her even attempting it. But he liked the film a lot, and I think that was largely because of Wyler. And but maybe of those three Wyler films, Jezebel would be my first, and I loved it as a kid too. It was my favorite film of hers. And when I was 4, I remember, in 1938, both Ted and I were crazy about Jezebel, and I think it had something to do with the long curls and the red dress. The shocking red dress, which was actually a black dress, because there was a color portrait of her in Life magazine in the ball gown dress, and it was black because red didn't photograph shockingly enough. It wasn't dark enough, dramatic enough. So the film was really, the dress is really black for the film.
Wow. One more question. I saw another hand before.
Would it be impertinent to ask if you read one of your last letters to Chris or from Chris?
Okay. Do you have a suggestion, Kate?
You know what? You could read. You could read a story about Dobbin's Devotion, which is the one he wrote for you on your birthday in 1969.
Yes, I love that letter.
It has a sort of Beatrix Potter quality, and it's a short story.
It was written on my birthday, 1969, when I would have been 35, I think. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
A story about a Dobbin's devotion. There was an old Dobbin who wanted to give Kitty something of a certain shape and color, which he had lost part of. So he went to a place in Santa Monica, and they said, better go to a place where they sell men's clothes. And they said, have you tried the hotel? But the hotel didn't know. So old Dobb went to Pacific Palisades, where the lady said, no, unfortunately, but I hear there's a place on Ventura Boulevard at Coldwater Canyon where they have nothing else. So Dobb trotted over the hill, and how hot it was, and the flies got under his hat and stung him, but he found where it was, and they said, sorry, but our Mr. So-and-so has taken them all to the Pan Pacific, where there's a home show. So Drabble Doug trotted back over the hill, dragging his tail through Laurel Canyon, through all the dust, and he got into the Pan Pacific, and they laughed at him and tried to run him out. But he neighed and reared, and at last he found Mr. So-and-so, who was kind, but said, I've sold them all. But Mr. So-and-so told him to go to Gorham, just off San Vicente, and there, in a pet shop of all places, he found some. And this isn't really what he was thinking of, but he hopes Kitty will like it. Anyhow, it's truly a token of love on Kitty's birthday. And you know, and Kate asked me, what was it? And you know, I couldn't answer. And I thought, ever since you asked me, I was just sure I had to know and remember. But I just can't. Maybe it'll come to me one day.
on that note, I'd like to thank you, Don, for bringing some wonderful Hollywood glamour to this traditional barn in East Sussex, for recreating a slice of a legendary relationship, I know for myself, and I'm sure for a lot of people in this audience, and also referring to so many figures that you've met in the past, and Ian Forster and Ava Gardner. I don't know if they've very frequently been mentioned together. So it's been a very exciting and stimulating and evocative session for all of us. And I'd like to thank you, and obviously Kate as well, very much. Just a couple of things. You heard Kate refer to the animals. Actually, the volume of love letters between Don and Chris is titled The Animals for reasons that have now become obvious. In a minute, we'll take Don out to the bookstall, and I'm sure he'd be willing to sign copies. And also, I think probably most of you realise that the next event is going to be a showing of a film about their lives together, and Don will remain to introduce that film. So we'll thank them again, and if you wouldn't mind remaining seated while we take Don and Kate out. Thank you both very much.